Welcome back to BBC News, and let's go straight back to that breaking news of the last few minutes, because we were showing you the scenes in Beirut. I'll come back to the live pictures in a moment, but a massive explosion in the last little while from Beirut. There you see the seconds after that explosion, and we're hearing that there have been multiple explosions. That is coming to us from our correspondents on the ground in terms of the pictures you can see, and certainly Hugo Bachega, who's there in Beirut for us, telling us this explosion is in one of the strongholds in the south of Beirut, and the Israeli military also updating in the last few minutes, saying that Israel says that they are currently striking terror targets. That's how they describe it, currently striking terror targets belonging to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. This happened about, I would say, 5-7 minutes ago, and you can see just the skyline, Beirut, and the size of that explosion. And of course, it fits entirely with what we've seen in terms of tactics from Israel since Monday, the sorts of strikes, and of course the Lebanese authorities saying that between 700 and 800 people have been killed since Monday and the start of those aerial attacks on different targets in Lebanon. But we have seen that Hezbollah leadership directly targeted in multiple different attacks, but many of those attacks in Beirut itself. We saw this time last week one of the senior commanders and about a dozen senior figures of one particular unit killed in a strike also in Beirut, very similar to this. And that is a sort of pattern that we've been seeing, that their intelligence saying that they are carrying out these strikes. They always describe them as targeted strikes, but then when you see the pictures on the ground, you get a sense of the scale of the attack, taking out 2 or 3 buildings, apartment blocks, and that is why also there have been so many civilian casualties over the last few days. And we've heard that Lebanese hospitals overwhelmed. We've had warnings from Lebanese politicians, again, the foreign minister talking about events spiralling out of control, talking about the fears of a domino effect to the precipice. And again, we are seeing more of these attacks carried out by Israel. And they describe them as targeted. Hezbollah, also certainly local television, also talking about these strikes against leadership figures in Hezbollah. And of course, all of this comes back to what we heard from Benjamin Netanyahu at the UN General Assembly. He was explaining to world leaders what he was trying to achieve. He kept saying we have to continue to defend our country. We want to get our citizens back into northern Israel, but we saw so many leaders walk out even before he started speaking. And there is so much concern about this new phase of this new conflict, because we've seen rockets being fired from Lebanon by Hezbollah, and of course they are a prescribed terror group by the UK government, the US government, and many other governments, and they have fired rockets into Israel since October the 7th. But a new phase, only a couple of weeks ago, Israel's Prime Minister adding a new war goal, and that was to enable Israeli citizens to return to their homes in northern Israel. And this is what we're seeing, this new phase of that operation. But so many military analysts saying you cannot do this simply from the air. Hezbollah won't stop firing rockets. They won't allow those people back till there's some sort of wider agreement in Gaza. And so the next leg of how they actually achieve their objectives, that remains unclear. And it was one of the things that was unsaid at the UN in New York, exactly how Benjamin Netanyahu intends to actually make good that promise. So these strikes can continue, but if the ultimate goal is to get Israeli citizens back into their homes in those communities that have been evacuated, well, can he do that without a further ground incursion? And that is what so many people fear, is that this is the prelude to maybe a ground incursion. And that was tried, of course, in 2006, and of course it in the end did not work. Hezbollah continued to exist. It was devastating for both sides, that particular phase of the conflict. But we arrive back at a very similar place all these years on. And of course there are warnings inside Israel. There are said to be splits between various figures in the defence forces about the wisdom of potentially going in. But of course it is a very fragile coalition government that Benjamin Netanyahu leads, and of course there are far right figures in that coalition who want him to press on, who don't want to talk about any sort of ceasefire that has been talked about by the international community. These are the earlier pictures, but I'll bring in the live pictures from Beirut now. You can see just that black plume subsiding slightly, but still evidence of it. And I suspect in the next little while we'll get pictures from ground level as we continue to have reports of more explosions being heard in Beirut. But I was referencing what was happening in New York because, of course, over the last couple of days there was a real push by the Americans, the French, to get some sort of ceasefire in this border region. And there were reports that the Israelis and Benjamin Netanyahu had given a verbal assurance they would go along with that. But then when Benjamin Netanyahu spoke for the first time about it, that was dismissed. And over the last 24 hours, new words have been put out, because certainly the Americans, surprised by what they heard from Israel's Prime Minister and the rebuff that it was. And of course it meant that the ceasefire talk went absolutely nowhere. And of course we've been reporting that and reaction to that from the US, but we are still in a very dangerous place where the talk of a ceasefire ebbs away, and this is what we're seeing playing out, with more explosions, another day of strikes from Israel, another day of Hezbollah launching rockets in the opposite direction. We'll speak to Anna Foster, who's in Beirut, in a moment or two. I can see the line that is being established to her, so we'll bring her in. She's there on the ground, giving us a real sense of what is happening there. But the skyline shot of Beirut that also gives you a clear picture of what is going on, with the Israeli military also updating. They are very quick when we see these large explosions to say what they are trying to do, and they talk about a Hezbollah stronghold. As we return to the pictures from, just looking at the clock, about 15 minutes ago was when we had the first of these very, very large explosions. And so we continue to remain on this precipice where the Israeli foreign minister was talking about the real fears of a domino effect, but Benjamin Netanyahu absolutely clear in what he was saying. He started that speech at the UN saying, "We are winning." That was what he was saying to world leaders in reference to Gaza. He talked about the huge numbers of fighters in Gaza, the Hamas fighters that they had killed. He talked about the infrastructure that they had destroyed. He talked about the tunnels that had been destroyed, and he said we will continue, and again was talking about trying to wipe out Hamas completely. It is very clear that he does not want Hamas to be involved in any way in whatever happens in terms of reconstruction of Gaza. He couldn't have been clearer in those words he used about Gaza. But then he turned to what we're seeing in Lebanon, and of course what we're seeing in Lebanon really turned into a completely new phase 2 Mondays ago, with those pager explosions, thousands of pagers exploding. Of course what is believed to be a Mossad operation which targeted, had infiltrated their intelligence, their security, to somehow sabotage those pagers, make them blow up. And of course, those, 4,500 pagers have been circulated principally to Hezbollah fighters, but were also used by many other people there in Lebanon, and hence the number of casualties we saw. But that is when this new phase started. The pager explosions, that was followed the next day by the exploding walkie-talkies, and then just a few days later, the start of these aerial strikes that initially were around the border areas, were in the southern suburbs of Beirut, but also the southern part of Lebanon, and then peppered amongst them these huge strikes that have been conducted in Beirut itself. Well, I think we can bring in Anna Foster, who's in Beirut. We're pretty close to actually getting her on the line. She is just establishing, and of course, when things like this happen, communications get disrupted on the ground. But we've established the line now, and Anna, let me bring you in, because for the last 12-15 minutes we've been looking at the pictures of these huge blasts there in Beirut. You are there. Just describe to us what you've seen, you've heard, and what you're hearing about where this actually has taken place.
Yeah, well, let me tell you, Matthew, first of all, it was a question of hearing, but also a question of actually physically feeling, because those blasts were so loud that you could actually feel them reverberating through. I was just in this spot here where you've spoken to me so many times over the last few days, and the sun was just setting, and then we heard very, very loudly these repeated blasts, maybe about 8 repeated blasts that absolutely split the air here in Beirut. And then just around the corner of the building that I'm on, we could see down to the southern suburbs, and a huge sort of plume, a great cloud of smoke that you've been seeing there on your pictures, rising into the sky, tinted by the setting sun. There were pinks and oranges, and I'm really just trying to, explain and express the size of that cloud, because we've seen, haven't we, again, pictures over the last few days of these columns of smoke rising into the air. But to actually see that here in central Beirut, I mean, there were even sort of car alarms that were going off in the street. Such was the force of that blast. Now, we know that it's in Dahir, which is in the southern suburbs, which is an area that I was in yesterday, because there'd been another of what Israel calls precision strikes on a building where they targeted yesterday one of Hezbollah's top commanders. It would appear that that is what they are trying to do again today, and that is why they focus on this area in Dahir, Anna, where the Hezbollah leadership are actually based. Yes, Matthew?
Anna, sorry to interrupt you, but a couple of things I want to do. I want to put these new live pictures on, because those blasts are still going on 2 really important lines, Anna, that I'm sure you're seeing as I'm seeing them, which is that the AFP news agency is reporting Israel's army saying they have struck Hezbollah's headquarters in Beirut, in a suburb of Beirut, and also Hezbollah's TV arm is saying and showing what they describe as a smouldering crater, also in Beirut's southern suburb. So it gives you just a bit more information about where these strikes are actually taking place.
And even as we're speaking, Matthew, I'm looking at pictures that are coming through again on the Lebanese TV stations, things that people have filmed on their phone. Again, there's one that I'm just looking at now, which is, it just shows you that the size really and the scale. And when I told you that we heard these multiple sounds, these multiple explosions, you can see them sort of joining together in the pictures that somebody's taken here on their phone, which is being played on Lebanese TV at the moment. Now, the suggestion is that it is near actually a restaurant that we drove past only yesterday. It's a very sort of large, grand building with sort of crenellations and coloured glass in the windows, a very sort of significant landmark. Now, there's no suggestion that that is the building that's been targeted, but certainly around that area. And as you say, the reports are that Israel is saying that it has targeted the Hezbollah sort of command centre. They're suggesting that that is sort of underground in Dahir. And as you know, Matthew, you've covered stories like this before. It's sort of that stage now where there are so many different lines coming in. I'm looking at pictures as we're speaking to you, people suggesting that really the size of the blast, it would be suggestive of a significant death toll, because that is a very highly populated area. And you'll have seen actually yesterday here on BBC News, when I was down there, I went to the site of a similar strike yesterday, and we're talking about apartment buildings, very densely packed together, shops underneath. It was still just about light when it happened, so people sort of out on the streets in that area. So as we wait to see more details, as I say, things just coming in all the time. The one thing that we do know, and the one thing that you're showing there, Matthew, is the size of this, this cloud of smoke. I can describe to you the sound and the feel of those explosions. And this really would appear to be, at this stage, probably the most significant attack that we've seen on Beirut since this latest phase of the conflict began.
Well, that's a really significant last sentence that you've just said. And I suppose what it fits with was everything we heard from Israel's Prime Minister at the United Nations in that speech, where he said about these operations in Beirut, in Lebanon, they will continue until all of their objectives are met.
Exactly. We were talking about that, weren't we, on the programme, Matthew, not long ago at the conclusion of that speech. And you and I were discussing what he talked about and what he didn't talk about. And while he, as you said that the operations against Hezbollah would continue, that they would do everything that they needed to do to get people in the north of Israel back into those homes that they left nearly a year ago now, he didn't mention that ceasefire. And of course, we should talk about the ceasefire, because the day before yesterday, it was put out by, it was an American-French proposal, but other allies involved as well. And what they were mooting was a 21-day ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. 21 days where the strikes would stop, the Israeli airstrikes on Lebanon would stop, and the Hezbollah firing of its own missiles into Israel would stop, while the two sides attempted to try and come to some sort of arrangement that would lead to de-escalation. Now, he made that speech. He didn't refer to the ceasefire in the speech at all. And you do wonder, Matthew, if the timing is notable. This happened sort of maybe an hour, 90 minutes after that speech concluded in New York. You do wonder if it was a sort of very physical representation of that verbal message that was delivered at the UN by Benjamin Netanyahu.